Hello and welcome back to Poli-Sci 110. In this lecture, we'll discuss how justices of the U.S. Supreme Court choose cases to hear, and also how senators choose justices, or which ones to cast a confirmed vote for or to support. So let's begin with this idea of the Supreme Court docket. The docket refers to the number of cases that the court takes up every year, or the court's agenda. Every year, the court hears about 60 to 70 cases per year. However, these numbers have changed over time. If we look at the total docket from about 1945 until 2016 or so, we find that the court used to hear about 100 to 140 or so cases per year until sometime in the late 1980s. And about since then, it's heard about 60 to 80 cases per year. Now, it is curious, what might be driving this variation? Why is the court no longer hearing or deciding as many cases as it used to? So there are a number of reasons for this change. One thing that has remained constant, however, is something called the rule of four. In order for a Supreme Court to hear a case, at least 4 justices have to decide that there is a constitutional question big enough here worth deciding. In other words, 4 justices have to support hearing a case. Even though many cases are appealed to the Supreme Court, sometimes several thousand cases in a year, the court simply cannot hear all of them, and many of them do not have a substantial enough constitutional question involved in order to be heard before the Supreme Court. And often when the Supreme Court does not hear some of those cases, the decisions of lower courts stand, particularly federal lower courts, those circuit courts that receive less media attention, but that you occasionally do hear about. So 4 justices have been required to hear cases. The rule of 4 has remained the same throughout the time period we looked at. Why might there be differences over time? So there are internal changes that help to explain what's happening. It turns out that whenever justices of the Supreme Court are more ideologically homogenous, that is, they tend to all agree with each other more often, then they tend to hear more cases. So what that means is that if the court is narrow, as in all of the justices tend to lean liberal or conservative, in other words, they're ideologically homogenous, to use that phrase again, then there's less uncertainty about what the other justices might do. So imagine yourself, you are a member of this 9-justice Supreme Court, and you have a particular ideology. If the Supreme Court is very diverse in terms of liberals and conservatives, and you're not sure which way or what kind of decision the court would issue if it heard a case, then you very well may be less willing to grant cert to particular cases because the outcome is less predictable. However, if the court is ideologically narrow, if you have colleagues on the court whom you are certain will agree with you, then you may very well feel more comfortable granting cert to more cases. That is, granting the cert, granting a writ of certiorari, and therefore hearing the case. Now, of course, there are also other changes. Some justices in the past have been particularly skillful at persuading other justices to hear cases. Byron White, for example, a former football player who ended up on the Supreme Court, was particularly adept at persuading his fellow justices to grant cert to more cases. But there have also been external changes as well. Over the years, Congress has changed the court's jurisdiction somewhat, and there was a law in 1988 that did reduce the number of cases that the Supreme Court was required to hear. So this also had somewhat of a mechanical effect on the number of cases the court hears or the size of the court's docket. So now that we've learned a bit about how the Supreme Court chooses cases to hear, how do United States senators vote on nominees? Political scientists have also studied this issue in depth and have some conclusions to offer. Ideology seems to be very important to senators in terms of how close do they think a nominee's ideology is to their own ideology as well. But there are other factors as well, such as the qualifications. Is a nominee from the president highly qualified or not so qualified for the office? And of course, there's party, the president's popularity. Presidents who are more popular tend to have their justices more often confirmed, and public opinion towards the justice as well, and various other contextual issues, timing, for example. So if we were to chart out the effect of party, for example, here we have a figure where we have the senator's probability of voting to confirm a justice, and we have two different lines here. So for example, if a senator is from the same party as the president, then the senator is always very likely to approve of the nominee to the Supreme Court. This is regardless of the ideological distance between the senator and the nominee. However, if the senator is from the opposing party, then we start to see that ideological distance really does have quite an effect in turning the senator against the justice. So, for example, for the green line over here with 0, a justice who agrees ideologically with the senator, even from nominated from a president, by a president from the opposite party, will still attract support from the senator because they agree ideologically. But as the distance grows between the senator's ideology and the nominee's ideology, the probability of that senator supporting the nominee declines precipitously to nearly 0. This is, of course, for above average qualifications by party. Political scientists have also found that qualifications matter as well. So from a study by Epstein and Siegel, for example, whenever nominees are highly qualified and the ideological distance between the nominee and the senator is very close, there's a very strong possibility that the senator will vote to approve of the nominee. That is, they will vote to confirm the nominee. Whenever the nominee is not qualified and very distant from the senator's ideology, this probability goes to nearly 0. And of course, we can compare different conditions across each row and each column. So even for a Supreme Court nominee who's not qualified for that office, if they're ideologically close to the senator is very certain to vote to confirm the nominee regardless. But at the same time, if someone is highly qualified, they can make up for their ideological difference. So the point here is that US senators tend to weigh a variety of factors whenever they choose whether to confirm a nominee for the US Supreme Court. They tend to weigh party identification as well as ideology, as well as the qualification of the nominee for the office. And so we can't always predict how a senator may cast a vote, but very often, based on the statistics, we have a pretty good idea of how many senators will support a nominee or not.